the mysterious disappearance of Malaysia's Boeing 777 Flight MH370. To this day, it remains one of the most mysterious disappearances in civil aviation history. Netflix has continued to produce and release a more detailed and in-depth documentary about this mysterious event. On the occasion of 9 years since authorities last received signals from the ill-fated plane. Let's not waste any more time and listen to analyses from our team at Way Too Weird Movie about the 3 hypotheses Netflix and its aviation experts have proposed. Everything began at 12:41 on the 8th of March 2014. Flight MH370 took off from Kuala Lumpur Airport, Malaysia as scheduled, en route to Beijing, China in the middle of the night and was expected to arrive at dawn. There were 227 passengers on board, including 153 of Chinese origin, 10 crew members, Captain Zahari Amasa, 53 years old, and First Officer Farik Abdul Hamid, 27 years old. The last communications between Kuala Lumpur Air Traffic Control and the captain of Flight MH370 were requests to contact the Ho Chi Minh Air Traffic Control Center in Vietnam, as Flight MH370 was en route to the South China Sea and approaching our country's airspace. The only response Malaysia Airlines received from Zahari was a haunting goodnight message that lingered thereafter. When the plane entered the grey zone between the two countries' air traffic control regions. The most mysterious situation emerged only 90 seconds after the final contact, when the Boeing 777 Flight MH370 unexpectedly vanished from air traffic control radar, lost all electronic signals, and officially lost contact at 1:20 a.m. on March 8, 2014. By 6:30 a.m. on the same day, 5 hours after the last contact, information about the mysterious disappearance of Flight MH370 began to flood global newspapers and social media. The only clues Malaysia had at this point were information from an employee at an oil rig station in the South China Sea region. This person said that on the same night, they saw an explosion in the sky. Additionally, some other reports indicated they saw oil streaks extending about 10 to 15 kilometers on the sea surface. However, after the area where MH370 last emitted signals in the South China Sea was cordoned off, none of the authorities could confirm the actual location of the ill-fated aircraft. Because the clues all led to a dead end and no one could actually sight the remains of Flight MH370 in the South China Sea, several hundred miles off the Vietnamese coastline. Can only be sustained until around 8:30 in the morning. But until midday the same day, no place was able to issue a statement about the damages from a plane crash due to fuel exhaustion. 2 days after the last contact on March 10, 2014, the latest announcements about MH370 were made public. Malaysian authorities unexpectedly announced that the aircraft MH370 deviated from its main flight path by hundreds of kilometers and flew in the opposite direction by 180 degrees since its last contact. These announcements were ambiguously verified through Malaysia's military radar, which stated that their radar had detected a signal in the sky over the Strait of Malacca. This confirmation is vague in that the military radar could only detect an unidentified object in the sky. They could not determine what type of aircraft it was, for example, whether it was a civilian plane or a helicopter, and they could not confirm this. Therefore, determining whether it was the MH370 remains uncertain to this day. However, the data indicating that there were no other flights in Malaysian airspace at that time somewhat proved that the Boeing 777 with the designation MH370 had indeed turned around and flew south more than an hour later. However, military radar also has certain limitations. Therefore, what Malaysian authorities were able to determine is that the aircraft turned back and continued to disappear as it left the coverage area of the military radar. By March 11, 72 hours since the last contact, 40 ships and 34 specialized aircraft had been deployed to the last known position, receiving signals from the MH370 aircraft. But ultimately, they could not locate the aircraft's actual whereabouts. A week after the last contact, on March 15, the Prime Minister of Malaysia, Mr. Najib Razak, officially stepped forward to announce the latest details in the disappearance of the MH370 aircraft. This was through data from satellites. After severing contact with air traffic control, the MH370 aircraft turned back toward Malaysia before veering northwest. Now, information about the Inmarsat satellite has officially emerged. A satellite has declared that it continuously received the last signal from the MH370 aircraft. However, data from Inmarsat indicated that MH370 could crash in one of two flight corridors, one in the southern Indian Ocean and the other in northern Central Asia within the territory of Kazakhstan. At the same time, the search area now extends up to hundreds of thousands of square kilometers. The greatest shock the world has received so far is learning that the airplane has been flying continuously for a full 6 hours since it was last detected by satellites. Now, the leading hypothesis is that flight MH370 deviated its course by hundreds of thousands of kilometers, not due to an accident, but was deliberately steered towards the southern Indian Ocean, a region entirely surrounded by water, completely remote, and certainly with no survivors. At the same time, the Malaysian authorities continued to unsettle people by investigating the residences of Captain Zahari and First Officer Farik. But the primary suspect at this point is Captain Zahari, who has many years of experience in the aviation industry. Additionally, what has raised suspicion about Zahari is that he has a flight simulator at home, something relatively common among pilots. However, the concerning thing is that during his flight simulation sessions, Zahari had once attempted to fly the simulator on a route identical to the way MH370 is believed to have crashed. In the simulated flight, Zahari's airplane also did not have a specific landing point in the southern Indian Ocean. Although the location believed to be where MH370 crashed and Zahari's simulated position are several hundred miles apart. But the way both flights ended inevitably raises questions about the captain of MH370. Adding another detail, experts cannot explain why the air pressure in MH370 was also lost and the oxygen in the emergency masks only functioned for about 15 minutes, while the captain's and first officer's masks lasted much longer, providing the captain with the opportunity to freely control the airplane for many hours without anyone intervening. If it is the case that Captain Zahari indeed committed suicide and took along 227 passengers and 11 other crew members. And on March 24, 2014, the Boeing 777 with flight number MH370 was officially announced to have crashed into the southern Indian Ocean, and 227 passengers along with 12 crew members were also declared deceased. Returning to the first hypothesis, the only flaw in the story about Captain Zahari's decision to commit suicide and kill all his passengers lies in the flight duration of MH370. If he intended suicide and others' death, Zahari reasonably wouldn't have to stay airborne non-stop for 6 hours. Not to mention that Zahari himself was an extremely pure person. He was trusted by colleagues, family and friends. He also had a fulfilling life and a positive existence, regularly uploading to his personal YouTube channel to share tips and tricks for everyday life. It is precisely this contradiction that has led us to the second hypothesis about a non-pilot incident and political conflicts. One of the valuable clues that has been discovered is the device used to communicate between MH370 and the satellite. It was the first device turned off before all other electronic devices on the plane were shut down. And suspiciously, this device was activated again afterwards. This is the main clue used to strengthen the second hypothesis. If someone intended to escape and disappear the plane, why would the device turn back on immediately? Additionally, another clue is that most pilots are not trained on how to turn this device off and on, since it's not supposed to be turned off, so they wouldn't be instructed. And in the case of MH370, it's only possible that it was affected by a third party. In a typical commercial airplane, the main equipment center from the brains of all electronic devices is located in an enclosure between the cockpit and the cabin. But suspiciously, for Boeing 777s at that time, the hatch to hide this enclosure was not locked, and anyone in the cabin or crew could access it unnoticed and turn off these critically important electronic devices. That was the deadly flaw of the MH370 airplane. At the time MH370 disappeared, several US giant mushroom-shaped radar planes were dispatched to monitor the airspace. With their advanced systems, these Boeing aircraft can monitor and see everything within a 600-kilometer radius. Coincidentally, on that fateful night, this system was able to fully view the entire area of the sea where MH370 was believed to have crashed. But in the end, there was nothing there. Returning to Inmarsat's data. It turns out that the data from this system can be entirely altered through the aforementioned control room. Therefore, the second hypothesis proposed by experts is that instead of the MH370 airplane ending its journey in the southern Indian Ocean, it is highly likely that a sophisticated alteration within the electronic compartment changed its actual final location to the opposite side, in the deserts of central Kazakhstan, a remote and relatively impoverished area, incapable of sophisticated cyber attacks but an ally of Russia. The next suspect in this case is a perpetrator who caused significant damage to Malaysia Airlines 4 months later. Among the flight's passengers suspected of piracy were 3 Russian nationals. One sat about 5 meters from the electronic compartment, a convenient location for a piracy operation if they were indeed the culprits. As for the motive of the Russian in this case, let's rewind time to February 28, 2014, 8 days before the MH370 disappearance. At that time, Russia infuriated the entire world with its decision to land in Crimea, a peninsula located in southern Ukraine, through an armed invasion. And clearly, to mislead everyone, the disappearance of the civilian plane is a perfect pretext. Therefore, this second hypothesis leans towards Russia deliberately sending people onto the plane to control the control room in the electronic compartment, causing MH370 to make a 360-degree turn and then veer towards Kazakhstan to conceal its whereabouts. Of course, before boarding, some false signals would be transmitted downward to mislead the investigation. This hypothesis is further reinforced by the fact that no one has ever found the plane wreckage in the southern Indian Ocean. If it were truly there according to the parameters, logically it should have been found early, or at least pieces of the plane should have been discovered sooner. The flaw of this hypothesis lies in the fact that the plane could indeed have its power cut off in the electronic compartment. But to control a large Boeing 777, it cannot be done directly beneath. It must be done through the cockpit of the captain and first officer. The turning point in the MH370 plane case occurred on July 29, 2015, 16 months after the last communication. A piece of the airplane drifted ashore on the coast of Réunion Island, a French territory in the Indian Ocean. This object was subsequently quickly confirmed to be the left wing of the Boeing 777, and it could only belong to the plane with the designation MH370. Because during those 16 months, there had been no other airplane accidents in the skies over this region of the ocean, besides the unfortunate incident of the Boeing 777 designated MH370. For the families of the passengers on the flight, everything seemed to have ended here. The MH370 aircraft had truly ended its journey in the remote waters of the far Indian Ocean, and the remains of the passengers and crew would never be found. However, for hypotheses and aviation experts, it seems that everything was just the beginning. Why was it that after such a long time, the wreckage was only discovered? Why, up to this point, did a series of other pieces start appearing on the coast so coincidentally and continuously in the following months? And the biggest question raised at this moment is whether someone behind the responsibility is indeed the one who threw these fragments back into the southern Indian Ocean region. Returning to the debris, only the left wing fragment has been confirmed to belong to an MH370 aircraft, while other debris have only been classified as possibly belonging to MH370. The left wing fragment itself also presents some suspicions, especially regarding the missing parts of its components. An identification plate on this left wing was missing, while other parts were almost intact and only corroded by seawater. The puzzling aspect is that the identification plate, a metal component in mechanics attached with rivets or bonded with special adhesive, withstands all pressures from temperature to extreme stresses.
However, it was missing when the left wing was found, and this hypothesis indicates that the left wing was disassembled using manual methods.
If it had been ejected due to physical impacts when the plane collided, the identification plate on the left wing could not have been lost.
Therefore, the third hypothesis, which is also the most controversial, suggests that the debris from the Boeing 777 found in the Indian Ocean was deliberately released rather than accidentally as the plane crashed. By January 17, 2017, 20 years and 10 months since the last contact, all efforts to locate the Boeing 777 with the identifier MH370 and its 239 passengers and crew were officially concluded, with the final determination that the team could not identify the true cause of the crash and the mysterious disappearance of the airplane. For the first time in the aviation industry, 239 people were declared dead based on data without any clear physical evidence.